The Truth of Masks, A Note on Illusion, by Oscar Wilde. In many of the somewhat violent attacks that have recently been made on that splendor of mounting which now characterizes our Shakespearean revivals in England, it seems to have been tacitly assumed by the critics that Shakespeare himself was more or less indifferent to the costume of his actors, and that, could he see Mrs. Langtry's production of Antony and Cleopatra, he would probably say that the play, and the play only, is the thing, and that everything else is leather and prunella. While, as regards any historical accuracy in dress, Lord Lytton, in an article in the 19th century, has laid it down as a dogma of art that archaeology is entirely out of place in the presentation of any of Shakespeare's plays, and the attempt to introduce it one of the stupidest pedantries of an age of prigs. Lord Lytton's position I shall examine later on, but as regards the theory that Shakespeare did not busy himself much about the costume wardrobe of his theatre, anybody who cares to study Shakespeare's method will see that there is absolutely no dramatist of the French, English, or Athenian stage who relies so much for his illusionist effects on the dress of his actors as Shakespeare does himself. Knowing how the artistic temperament is always fascinated by beauty of costume, he constantly introduces into his plays masks and dances purely for the sake of the pleasure which they give the eye. And we have still his stage directions from the three great processions in Henry VIII, directions which are characterized by the most extraordinary elaborateness of detail, down to the collars of SS and the pearls in Anne Boleyn's hair. Indeed, it would be quite easy for a modern manager to reproduce these pageants absolutely as Shakespeare had them designed, and so accurate were they that one of the court officials of the time, writing an account of the last performance of the play at the Globe Theatre to a friend, actually complains of their realistic character, notably of the production on the stage of the Knights of the Garter in the robes and insignia of the order, as being calculated to bring ridicule on the real ceremonies, much in the same spirit in which the French government, some time ago, prohibited that delightful actor, Monsieur Christian, from appearing in uniform, on the plea that it was prejudicial to the glory of the army that a colonel should be caricaturized. And elsewhere, the gorgeousness of apparel which distinguished the English stage under Shakespeare's influence was attacked by the contemporary critics, not as a rule, however, on the grounds of the democratic tendencies of realism, but usually on those moral grounds which are always the last refuge of people who have no sense of beauty. The point, however, which I wish to emphasize is, not that Shakespeare appreciated the value of lovely costumes in adding picturesqueness to poetry, but that he saw how important costume is as a means of producing certain dramatic effects. Many of his plays, such as Measure for Measure, Twelfth Night, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, All's Well That Ends Well, Cymbeline, and others, depend for their illusion on the character of the various dresses worn by the hero or the heroine. The delightful scene in Henry VI on the modern miracles of healing by faith loses all its point unless Gloucester is in black and scarlet, and the denouement of the Merry Wives of Windsor hinges on the color of Anne Page's gown. As for the uses Shakespeare makes of disguises, the instances are almost numberless. Posthumus hides his passion under a peasant's garb, and Edgar his pride beneath an idiot's rags. Portia wears the apparel of a lawyer, and Rosalind is attired in all points as a man. The cloak-bag of Pisciano changes Imogen to the young Fidel. Jessica flees from her father's house in boy's dress, and Julia ties up her yellow hair in fantastic love knots and dons hose and doublet. Henry VIII woos his lady as a shepherd, and Romeo his as a pilgrim. Prince Hal and Poins appear first as footpads and buckram suits, and then in white aprons and leather jerkins as the waiters in a tavern. And as for Falstaff, does he not come on as a highwayman, as an old woman, as Herne the Hunter, and as the clothes going to the laundry? Nor are the examples of the employment of costume as a mode of intensifying dramatic situation less numerous. After Slaughter of Duncan, Macbeth appears in his nightgown as if aroused from sleep. Timon ends in rags, the play he had begun in splendor. Richard flatters the London citizens in a suit of mean and shabby armor, and, as soon as he has stepped in blood to the throne, marches through the streets in crown and George and garter. The climax of The Tempest is reached when Prospero, throwing off his enchanter's robes, sends Ariel for his hat and rapier, and reveals himself as the great Italian duke. The very ghost in Hamlet changes his mystical apparel to produce different effects. And as for Juliet, a modern playwright would probably have laid her out in her shroud and made the scene a scene of horror merely, but Shakespeare arrays her in rich and gorgeous raiment, whose loveliness makes the vault a feasting presence full of light, turns the tomb into a bridal chamber, and gives the cue and motive for Romeo's speech of the triumph of beauty over death. Even small details of dress, such as the color of a major domo's stockings, the patterns of a wife's handkerchief, the sleeve of a young soldier, and a fashionable woman's bonnets, become in Shakespeare's hands points of actual dramatic importance. And by some of them, the action of the play in question is conditioned absolutely. Many other dramatists have availed themselves of costume as a method of expressing directly to the audience the character of a person on his entrance, though hardly so brilliantly as Shakespeare has done in the case of the dandy Paroles, whose dress, by the way, only an archaeologist can understand. The fun of a master and servant exchanging coats in presence of the audience, of shipwrecked sailors squabbling over the division of a lot of fine clothes, and of a tinker dressed up like a duke while he is in his cups, may be regarded as part of that great career which costume has always played in comedy, from the time of Aristophanes down to Mr. Gilbert. But nobody from the mere details of apparel and adornment has ever drawn such irony of contrast, such immediate and tragic effect, such pity and such pathos as Shakespeare himself. Armed cap up high, the dead king stalks on the battlements of Elsinore because all is not right with Denmark. Shylock's Jewish gabardine is part of the stigma under which that wounded and embittered nature writhes. Arthur, begging for his life, can think of no better plea than the handkerchief he had given Hubert. "Have you the heart? When your head did but ache, I knit my handkerchief around your brows. The best I had, a princess wrought it me, and I did never ask it you again." And Orlando's blood-stained napkin strikes the first sober note in that exquisite woodland idyll, and shows us the depth of feeling that underlies Rosalind's fanciful wit and wilful jesting. "Last night was on my arm, I kissed it. I hope it be not gone to tell my lord that I kiss aught but he," says Imogen, jesting on the loss of the bracelet which was already on its way to Rome to rob her of her husband's faith. The little prince, passing to the tower, plays with the dagger in his uncle's girdle. Duncan sends a ring to Lady Macbeth on the night of his own murder, and the ring of Portia turns the tragedy of the merchant into a wife's comedy. The great rebel York dies with a paper crown on his head. Hamlet's black suit is a kind of color motive in the piece, like the mourning of the Shaman in the Cid, and the climax of Antony's speech is the production of Caesar's cloak. I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on. 'Twas on a summer evening in his tent, the day he overcame the Nervi. Look, in this place ran Cassius's dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. Kind souls, what weep you when you but behold our Caesar's vesture wounded? The flowers which Ophelia carries with her in her madness are as pathetic as the violets that blossom on a grave. The effect of Lear's wandering on the heath is intensified beyond words by his fantastic attire, and when Claudin, stung by the taunt of that simile which his sister draws from her husband's raiment, arrays himself in that husband's very garb to work upon her the deed of shame, we feel that there is nothing in the whole of modern French realism, nothing even in Thérèse Raquin, that masterpiece of horror, which for terrible and tragic significance can compare with this strange scene in Cymbeline. In the actual dialogue also, some of the most vivid passages are those suggested by costume. Rosalind's, "Dost thou think, though I am caparisoned like a man, I have a doublet and hose in my disposition?" Constance's, "Grief fills the place of my absent child, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form." And the quick sharp cry of Elizabeth, "Ah, cut my lace asunder, are only a few of the many examples one might quote. One of the finest effects I have ever seen on the stage was Salvini, in the last act of Lear, tearing the plume from Kent's cap and applying it to Cordelia's lips when he came to the line, "This feather stirs, she lives." Mr. Booth, whose Lear had many noble qualities of passion, plucked, I remember, some fur from his archaeologically incorrect ermine for the same business, but Salvini's was the finer effect of the two, as well as the truer. And those who saw Mr. Irving in the last act of Richard III have not, I am sure, forgotten how much the agony and terror of his dream was intensified by contrast through the calm and quiet that preceded it, and the delivery of such lines as, "What, is my beaver easier than it was, and all my armor laid into my tent? Look that my staves be sound and not too heavy." Lines which had a double meaning for the audience, remembering the last words which Richard's mother called after him as he was marching to Bosworth. "Therefore take with thee my most grievous curse, which in the day of battle tire thee more than all the complete armor that thou wearest." As regards the resources which Shakespeare had at his disposal, it is to be remarked that, while he more than once complains of the smallness of the stage on which he has to produce big historical plays, and of the want of scenery which obliges him to cut out many effective open-air incidents, he always writes as a dramatist who had at his disposal a most elaborate theatrical wardrobe, and who could rely on the actors taking pains about their makeup. Even now it is difficult to produce such a play as The Comedy of Errors, and to the picturesque accident of Miss Ellen Terry's brother resembling herself, we owe the opportunity of seeing Twelfth Night adequately performed. Indeed, to put any play of Shakespeare's on the stage, absolutely as he himself wished it to be done, requires the services of a good property man, a clever wig maker, a costumer with a sense of color and a knowledge of textures, a master of the methods of making up, a fencing master, a dancing master, and an artist to direct personally the whole production. For he is most careful to tell us the dress and appearance of each character. Racine abhor la réalité, says Auguste Vacquerie somewhere. Il ne daime pas s'occuper dans son costume, si l'on s'en rapportait aux indications du poète. Agamemnon serait vêtu d'un sceptre et Achille d'une épée. But with Shakespeare it is very different. He gives us directions about the costumes of Perdita, Florizel, Autolycus, the witches in Macbeth, and the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, several elaborate descriptions of his fat knight, and a detailed account of the extraordinary garb in which Petruchio is to be married. Rosalind, he tells us, is tall, and is to carry a spear and a little dagger. Celia is smaller, and is to paint her face brown, so as to look sunburnt. The children who play at fairies in Windsor Forest are to be dressed in white and green, a compliment, by the way, to Queen Elizabeth, whose favorite colors they were, and in white, with green garlands and gilded visors, the angels are to come to Catherine in Kimbleton. Bottom is in homespun. Lysander is distinguished from Oberon by his wearing an Athenian dress, and Launce has holes in his boots. The Duchess of Gloucester stands in a white sheet with her husband in mourning beside her. The motley of the Fool, the scarlet of the Cardinal, and the French lilies broidered on the English coats are all made occasion for jest or taunt in the dialogue. We know the patterns on the Dauphine's armor and the Pucel's sword, the crest on Warwick's helmet, and the color of Bardolph's nose. Portia has golden hair, Phoebe is black-haired, Orlando has chestnut curls, and Sir Andrew Aguecheek's hair hangs like flax on a distaff, and won't curl at all. Some of the characters are stout, some lean, some straight, some hunchbacked, some fair, some dark, and some are to blacken their faces. Lear has a white beard, Hamlet's father a grizzled, and Benedick is to shave his in the course of the play. Indeed, on the subject of stage beards, Shakespeare is quite elaborate, tells us of the many different colors in use, and gives a hint to actors always to see that their own are properly tied on. There is a dance of reapers in rye straw hats, and of rustics in hairy coats like satyrs, a mask of Amazons, a mask of Russians, and a classical mask. several immortal scenes over a weaver in an ass's head, a riot over the colour of a coat which it takes the Lord Mayor of London to quell, and a scene between an infuriated husband and his wife's milliner about the slashing of a sleeve. As for the metaphor Shakespeare draws from dress, and the aphorisms he makes on it, he hits at the costume of his age, particularly at the ridiculous size of the ladies' bonnets, and the many descriptions of the mundus mulibrus, from the song of Autolycus in The Winter's Tale, down to the account of the Duchess of Milan's gown in Much Ado About Nothing. They are far too numerous to quote, though it may be worthwhile to remind people that the whole of the philosophy of clothes is to be found in Lear's scene with Edgar, a passage which has the advantage of brevity and style over the grotesque wisdom and somewhat mouthing metaphysics of Sartor Resartus. But I think that from what I have already said, it is quite clear that Shakespeare was very much interested in costume. I do not mean in that shallow sense by which it has been concluded, from his knowledge of deeds and daffodils, that he was the Blackstone and Paxson of the Elizabethan age, but that he saw that costume could be made at once impressive of a certain effect on the audience and expressive of certain types of character, and is one of the essential factors of the means which a true illusionist has at his disposal. Indeed, to him, the deformed figure of Richard was of as much value as Juliet's loveliness. He sets the serge of the radical beside the silks of the lord, and sees the stage effects to be got from each. He has as much delight in Caliban as he has in Ariel, in rags as he has in cloth of gold, and recognizes the artistic beauty of ugliness. The difficulty Ducis felt about translating Othello in consequence of the importance given to such a vulgar thing as a handkerchief, and his attempt to soften its grossness by making the Moor reiterate, "Le bandeau, le bandeau," may be taken as an example of the difference between la tragédie philosophique and the drama of real life, and the introduction for the first time of the word mouchoir at the Théâtre Français was an era in that romantic realistic movement of which Hugo is the father and Monsieur Zola the enfant terrible, just as the classicism of the earlier part of the century was emphasized by Talma's refusal to play Greek heroes any longer in a powdered periwig, one of the many instances, by the way, of that desire for archaeological accuracy in dress which has distinguished the great actors of our age. In criticizing the importance given to money in La Comédie Humaine, Théophile Gautier says that Balzac may claim to have invented a new hero in fiction, Le Héros Métallique. Of Shakespeare it may be said that he was the first to see the dramatic value of doublets, and that a climax may depend on a crinoline. The burning of the Globe Theatre, an event due, by the way, to the results of the passion for illusion that distinguished Shakespeare's stage management, has unfortunately robbed us of many important documents, but in the inventory, still in existence, of the costume wardrobe of a London theatre in Shakespeare's time, there are mentioned particular costumes for cardinals, shepherds, kings, clowns, friars, and fools, green coats for Robin Hood's men, and a green gown for Maid Marian, a white and gold doublet for Henry V, and a robe for Longshanks, besides surplices, copes, damask gowns, gowns of cloth of gold and of cloth of silver, taffeta gowns, calico gowns, velvet coats, satin coats, frieze coats, jerkins of yellow leather and of black leather, red suits, grey suits, French Pierrot suits, a robe for which to go invisible, which seems inexpensive at £3 10 and 4 incomparable farthingales, all of which show a desire to give every character an appropriate dress. There are also entires of Spanish, Moorish, and Danish costumes, of helmets, lances, painted shields, imperial crowns, and papal tiaras, as well as of costumes for Turkish janissaries, Roman senators, and all the gods and goddesses of Olympus, which evidence a good deal of archaeological research on the part of the manager of the theatre. It is true that there is a mention of a bodice for Eve, but probably the Danae of the play was after the fall. Indeed, anybody who cares to examine the age of Shakespeare will see that archaeology was one of its special characteristics. After that revival of the classical forms of architecture, which was one of the notes of the Renaissance, in the printing at Venice and elsewhere of the masterpieces of Greek and Latin literature, had come naturally an interest in the ornamentation and costume of the antique world. Nor was it for the learning that they could acquire, but rather for the loveliness that they might create, that the artists studied these things. The curious objects that were being constantly brought to light by excavations were not left to molder in a museum, for the contemplation of a callous curator, and the ennui of a policeman bored by the absence of crime. They were used as motives for the production of a new art, which was to be not beautiful merely, but also strange.